Deep in West Virginia's mountains, 1901. State police break down a barn door. What they find inside makes seasoned officers physically sick. 37 men, chained like livestock. Some have been missing for over a decade. But here's what makes your blood run cold. The entire town knew something was wrong. For 20 years, they chose silence. This is the true story of how two sisters built a kingdom of horror while neighbors, lawmen, and an entire community simply looked the other way. And the journalist who tried to expose them, he became victim number 38. The breeding barn belonging to the Pike Sisters. State police in 1901 made a discovery deep in West Virginia's mountains that would haunt them forever. 37 men chained inside that barn, missing for years. Yet the true horror wasn't what they found, it was how long the truth had been hidden in plain sight. Men disappeared for 2 decades along the old Pike Road. Travelers seeking work, young drifters with nowhere else to go. They'd head toward the Pike farm, then vanish without a trace. Whispers filled the town about Elizabeth and Martha Pike, 2 sisters living in isolation up there. Whispers about their strange ways, their uncanny ability to entrance men. Sheriff Brody dismissed it all, blamed the treacherous mountains, labeled them accidents. Then a Charleston journalist started digging for answers and uncovered something far more sinister than simple murder. A barn housing shattered men, some so destroyed they'd forgotten their very identities. Used like animals, bred like livestock, kept in chains. The reporter believed he was chasing a story. He became the 38th captive instead. How does an entire community choose silence while dozens of men endure unimaginable suffering mere miles away? Cold dust clung to everything in Black Creek like a persistent gray veil, making the mountain town feel perpetually suspended between seasons. Thomas Abernathy sensed it coating his throat the moment he stepped off the morning train, his leather bag weighing heavy with newspaper clippings and photographs of men who'd simply ceased to exist. 26 years old, already burdened with too many questions no one wanted answered. He'd journeyed from Charleston following rumors of a story most reasonable folks would dismiss as mountain legend. But Thomas had learned something crucial long ago. The most horrifying truths often hide behind the most convenient lies. The missing persons report spanned 2 decades, scattered like breadcrumbs across different counties, leading nowhere. Drifters mostly, men hunting work in the coal mines, passing through West Virginia's remote hollows, young men with work-worn hands and empty wallets who'd walked into these mountains and never emerged. Official records were sparse, filled with the casual indifference typical of small-town law enforcement more interested in maintaining peace than pursuing uncomfortable truths. But Thomas noticed what others had overlooked or deliberately ignored. Every single disappearance occurred within a 10-mile radius of the old Pike Road, a winding dirt track snaking through the county's most isolated parts, ending at a single weathered farmhouse. Behind his desk sat Sheriff Brody like a man who'd taken root there, his massive frame overflowing a chair that had clearly endured better decades. His eyes held the weary resignation belonging to someone who'd spent too many years explaining away the inexplicable. "Wasting your time, son," he muttered without glancing up from papers he was pretending to read. "These mountains devour people. Always have. Mine shafts cave in, rivers flood, men lose their way in the woods and freeze when winter hits. Nothing mysterious. Just nature claiming what belongs to her." Thomas had studied those reports, spotted the pattern Brody either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. The Pike Sisters, though, he pressed, watching the sheriff's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Their property appears in multiple witness statements, men spotted heading that direction before vanishing. Brody's laugh came out harsh and bitter. "The Pike women keep to themselves. Always have. Elizabeth and Martha have lived up there 15 years, since their daddy passed. Town folk leave them alone. They leave us alone. That's how things work here." His eyes finally lifted, hard as creek stones. "You'd be wise to remember that, Mr. Abernathy. We don't welcome outsiders stirring up trouble where none exists." The town itself seemed to echo Brody's warning. Conversations died when Thomas entered the general store, the post office, the small diner serving coffee strong enough to strip paint. Eyes tracked him with the suspicious intensity of people protecting something precious and fragile. When he inquired about the missing men, about Pike Road, about anything that might illuminate his investigation, he encountered the kind of silence that felt deliberate, practiced. The few who spoke offered only vague platitudes about mountain living's dangers and drifters' unfortunate tendency to keep drifting. Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman running the boarding house where Thomas had taken a room, first mentioned the whispers. She brought him coffee his second evening, hands trembling slightly as she set down the cup. "You're asking about things that should stay buried," she said without preamble. "The Pike women, they're not natural. Never have been. Their daddy was strange enough, God rest his soul. But those girls, something's wrong with them. Wrong deep in the soul." Thomas leaned forward, sensing a crack in the town's wall of silence. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Caldwell glanced toward the window as if expecting eavesdroppers in the gathering dusk. "They charm men," she whispered. That's what folks say. Men go up that mountain to their place and never come back the same. Some never come back at all. Been happening since they were young women, maybe 20 years now. Travelers mostly, men passing through who nobody would miss right away. The old woman's words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp yet impossible to ignore. Thomas pressed for details, but Mrs. Caldwell had already retreated behind that same protective wall of silence shielding the rest of town. Best finish your business here and move on, she said, gathering his empty dinner plate with shaking hands. Some stones are better left unturned. But Thomas had built his reputation on turning over stones, on excavating dark places where others feared to look. The next morning brought grey skies promising rain, perfect weather for what he'd planned. He told Mrs. Caldwell he'd write a human interest piece about life in remote West Virginia hollows, about families carving out existence in places the world had forgotten. Not entirely a lie, though the truth he suspected was far darker than anything fit for a respectable newspaper. Pike Road was barely wagon width, cutting through dense woods that seemed to swallow sound and light equally. Thomas walked for nearly an hour before trees finally opened onto a clearing where the Pike farmhouse squatted like a wounded creature. The house itself seemed unremarkable, a simple wooden structure that had weathered too many harsh winters without enough care. But the barn made Thomas's skin crawl, a low building that seemed oddly fortified for such remote location. Heavy timber beams reinforced the walls. Windows had been boarded from inside with newly installed planks. Thick iron locks secured the doors, more locks than any barn should need. As Thomas stood at the clearing's edge, a sound drifted from within the barn that froze his blood. Humming, low, rhythmic, strangely sorrowful, like someone singing a lullaby to comfort themselves against unimaginable despair. The sound rose and fell with almost hypnotic quality, occasionally joined by other voices in harmony that spoke of practiced familiarity with whatever ritual occurred behind those boarded windows. Profound dread washed over Thomas, that kind of primitive fear speaking to something deeper than rational thought. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, walk back down that mountain road, forget what he'd heard, pretend the Black Creek whispers were nothing more than small-town superstition. But the journalist in him, the part that had driven him to this forsaken place, demanded he stay and discover the truth behind the humming, the locks, and 20 years of men who'd walked into these mountains and never walked out. The farmhouse door opened before Thomas could knock, as if he'd been watched from the moment he entered the clearing. The woman standing in the doorway was tall and angular, her severe face carved from years of mountain hardship and something deeper, something that had calcified into permanent suspicion of the world beyond her property. Elizabeth Pike regarded him with eyes holding no warmth, no curiosity about why a stranger had walked up her mountain road on a grey October morning. She simply waited, powerful hands gripping the doorframe as if preparing to slam it shut at the first sign of trouble. "Miss Pike," Thomas said, removing his hat with practiced politeness. "Thomas Abernathy from the Charleston Gazette. I was hoping to speak with you about mountain life, perhaps for a story about families making homes in these remote places." The lie came easily, wrapped in respectful deference that usually opened doors in rural communities. But Elizabeth's expression didn't soften. "We don't talk to newspaper people," she stated, her voice carrying flat finality of someone accustomed to having the last word. "Got nothing to say that would interest city folk." From somewhere behind her came soft, musical laughter that raised the hair on Thomas's arms. Another woman appeared in the doorway, shorter than Elizabeth but sharing the same sharp features. Where Elizabeth's face was hard as granite, however, Martha Pike wore an expression of childlike wonder completely at odds with her 40-odd years. Her smile was too wide, too empty, like a painted mask never removed. "Now, sister," Martha said, her voice carrying the sing-song cadence of someone speaking to a child. "Perhaps the gentleman just wants to hear how we serve the Lord in our simple way. Wouldn't that be lovely, telling someone how we live according to His word?" She turned that unsettling smile toward Thomas, and he felt something cold crawl up his spine. "We're God-fearing women, Mr. Abernathy. Been caring for this land and doing His work 15 years, ever since our dear father passed to glory." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she stepped aside, allowing Thomas onto the covered porch. The farmhouse interior was sparse yet clean, furnished with handmade furniture speaking of isolation and self-sufficiency. Religious texts covered every available surface alongside dried herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters. The smell was overwhelming, sage and lavender and something else Thomas couldn't identify, something medicinal and slightly sweet. For nearly an hour, the sisters spoke of their simple lives with the practiced air of people who told the same story many times. They tended their garden, Elizabeth explained, kept a few chickens. They read scripture and prayed for less fortunate souls. Martha nodded along with everything her sister said, occasionally adding observations about God's creation's beauty and the peace they found in isolation. It was a performance, Thomas realized, as polished as any stage production. Every word rehearsed, every gesture calculated to present the image of two lonely women who'd found solace in faith and hard work. Thomas found himself almost believing it. The stories he'd heard in town began feeling like cruel gossip from people resenting anyone different, anyone choosing to live outside their community's narrow expectations. The Pike sisters were odd, certainly, but many mountain folk were peculiar by city standards. Perhaps the missing men really had fallen victim to harsh wilderness, and the sisters were simply convenient scapegoats for a town unwilling to accept that sometimes people vanished for no better reason than bad luck and poor judgment. He was preparing to leave when he saw it. The wooden bird sat on a small table near the door, so perfectly carved it seemed ready to take flight. Thomas had studied dozens of missing person posters in his research, memorized every photograph and description until faces blurred together. But this particular detail had stuck with him because of its specificity. Jacob Morrison, age 24, a traveling woodcarver who'd vanished 5 years earlier passing through the county. The poster mentioned Morrison was known for carving small birds, each one unique, each bearing his distinctive style of intricate featherwork making them seem almost alive. The bird on the Pike sisters' table was identical to the one in Morrison's photograph, down to the tiny notches representing individual feathers, the way the head tilted as if listening for some distant sound. Thomas felt his carefully constructed rationalization crumble like a house of cards. This wasn't coincidence or imagination or small-town prejudice. This was evidence sitting in plain sight like a trophy. He managed to maintain composure long enough to thank the sisters for their time, promised to portray their simple lives with deserved respect. But his hands shook as he walked back down the mountain road, and the humming from the barn seemed to follow him long after the farmhouse disappeared behind trees. That night, Thomas broke into the courthouse with a skill that would have surprised anyone knowing him as a respectable journalist. The back door lock was old and poorly maintained, yielding to his pocket knife and a few minutes of careful manipulation. The building creaked around him as he made his way to the records room, guided by his electric torch's thin beam and an urgency bordering on desperation. Property records told a story of methodical acquisition that had gone unnoticed by anyone who might have cared. Over the past 20 years, the Pike sisters had quietly purchased every piece of land surrounding their original farm, using money with no obvious source. 12 separate parcels, each bought for cash, each transaction pushing their property line further into wilderness and further from curious neighbors' eyes. They'd created a kingdom of isolation, a place where whatever happened stayed hidden behind walls of forest and deliberate secrecy. The missing person files painted an even darker picture. Thomas spread the reports across a dusty table and watched the pattern emerge with horrible clarity. Every man who'd vanished had last been seen near Pike Road or asking directions to the Pike farm. Some seeking work. Others simply passing through. All were young. All traveled alone. All disappeared without leaving so much as a footprint behind. It was nearly dawn when Thomas found the complaint buried deep in a box of dismissed cases gathering dust for a decade. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the words of a traveling preacher named Ezekiel Marsh, who'd accused the Pike sisters of ungodly seductions and holding a man against his will in violation of Christian decency and human law. Marsh claimed to have witnessed men working the Pike farm who moved like sleepwalkers, who seemed afraid to meet his eyes or speak above a whisper. He demanded an investigation, threatened to contact state authorities if local law enforcement refused to act. Sheriff Brody's predecessor had dismissed the complaint as a drunk's ravings, noting in the margin that Marsh had been found intoxicated outside the local saloon on 3 separate occasions. No investigation was conducted. No questions asked. The complaint had been filed away and forgotten, another inconvenient truth buried beneath willful ignorance's weight. Thomas sat in pale morning light streaming through courthouse windows, the complaint trembling in his hands as he finally understood the full scope of what he faced. This wasn't just a story about missing men or strange mountain women. This was about a conspiracy of silence stretching back decades. About a community that had chosen comfort over conscience, convenience over justice. The truth was here, had been here all along, waiting for someone willing to dig deep enough to find it. The weight of 20 years of buried truth pressed down on Thomas like a physical thing as he made his way back up Pike Road 3 nights later, his pockets heavy with breaking and entering tools he'd never imagined needing. The pry bar felt alien in his hands, cold steel speaking of violence and desperation rather than the careful craft of journalism he'd always prided himself on. But the wooden bird haunted his dreams, and the faces of 37 missing men demanded more than careful questions and polite inquiries. They demanded action, even if it meant crossing lines he'd never thought to approach. The farmhouse sat dark against the October sky, no light visible in any road-facing windows. Thomas had watched the property for 2 nights, noting the sisters' habits with the patience of a man understanding that haste would mean discovery, and discovery would mean joining the ranks of those who'd walked into these mountains and never walked out. The sisters retired early and rose with dawn, their movements as predictable as moon phases. By midnight, the only sounds came from the barn, that low humming that never seemed to cease, punctuated occasionally by other noises Thomas preferred not to examine too closely. The barn door yielded to his pry bar with a groan of protesting wood that seemed to echo across the entire valley. Thomas held his breath, waiting for lights to appear in farmhouse windows, for the sisters to come running with shotguns and righteous fury. But the house remained dark, and after several minutes feeling like hours, Thomas slipped inside the barn and closed the door behind him. The smell hit him first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else, something medicinal and cloying that made his stomach turn. His lantern cast dancing shadows across the interior as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. And what he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. They were chained to walls and support beams like animals, and nearly 3 dozen men in various states of physical and mental decay. Some were so thin their ribs showed through skin that had gone pale as parchment from years without sunlight. Others rocked back and forth in rhythm matching the humming, their eyes vacant, staring at nothing. Thomas moved among them like a man walking through his own nightmare, his lantern illuminating faces ranging from teenagers to men in their 40s. Some watched him with desperate hope of those who still remembered what freedom felt like, while others seemed not to notice his presence at all. The chains were new, heavy iron links bolted into the barn's foundation with the kind of permanence speaking of years of planning and preparation. Water buckets and crude chamber pots were scattered throughout the space. In one corner sat piles of simple clothing and blankets reeking of neglect and despair. Near the back of the barn, Thomas found Samuel, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, dark hair matted but eyes still holding a flicker of intelligence that had once defined him. Unlike many others, Samuel focused on Thomas immediately, his gaze sharp with recognition and desperate hope. "You're not one of them," he whispered, his voice raw from disuse but carrying urgency that cut through the barn's oppressive atmosphere. "Please, you have to get us out of here." Thomas knelt beside him, examining the heavy chain securing Samuel's ankle to an iron ring embedded in the barn wall. "How long have you been here?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. 3 months, maybe 4, Samuel replied, words coming in quick, frightened bursts as if he feared being overheard. "I was heading west, looking for work in the Colorado mines. They offered me a meal and a place to sleep. Said I could work their farm a few days to earn traveling money. The tea tasted strange, bitter. When I woke up, I was here." He gestured toward the other captives with movement speaking of practiced caution. "Some of these men have been here for years. The older ones don't even remember their names anymore. The sisters use us for labor during the day, make us work their fields, tend their animals. But at night..." Samuel's voice trailed off, and Thomas saw him shudder despite the barn's stifling warmth. "What happens at night?" "They come for us," Samuel whispered. "Not all of us, never all at once. They choose 1 or 2, sometimes more if they're feeling particularly inspired. They have rituals, ceremonies, they call them. They believe they're building something pure, something holy. A new bloodline. They say they're mothers of a chosen people. They drug us with herbs that make us compliant, make us forget ourselves. And afterward, they chain us back up like we're nothing more than breeding stock. The horror of it struck Thomas like a physical blow, the casual way Samuel described atrocities defying comprehension. These weren't just missing men. They were slaves, prisoners in a nightmare that had been allowed to continue for decades while an entire community looked the other way. "The town knows," Thomas said, more to himself than to Samuel. "They have to know." Samuel laughed, a bitter sound holding no humor whatsoever. "The town knows exactly what it wants to know. Sheriff Brody comes by sometimes, always in daylight when we're working the fields. The sisters tell him we're hired hands, men who work for room and board. He sees our chains and calls them leg irons to keep us from running off with their property. A practical arrangement, he says, for dealing with drifters and troublemakers." Thomas began working at Samuel's chain with the pry bar, looking for any weakness in the iron links or mounting that might yield to leverage and desperation. The metal was well maintained and solidly anchored, but Thomas had noticed a loose floorboard near Samuel's position that might provide the angle he needed. "I'm going to get you out of here," he promised, though he wasn't sure how he could possibly free nearly 3 dozen men without raising an alarm that would bring the sisters running. "Just me won't be enough," Samuel said, understanding immediately what Thomas was thinking. "If you take one of us, they'll know someone was here. They'll move the others. Probably kill them rather than risk exposure. You need to get help. Bring state police or federal marshals. Someone with authority Brody can't dismiss or intimidate." But as Thomas worked at the chain, his mind racing through possibilities and plans, the barn door opened behind them with a creak that seemed to announce the end of hope itself. Elizabeth Pike stood silhouetted against moonlight, her powerful frame filling the doorway like an avenging angel of terrible purpose. In her hand she carried an axe handle worn smooth by years of use and stained dark with substances Thomas preferred not to identify. "Well, now," she said, her voice carrying calm satisfaction that was somehow more terrifying than any scream of rage would have been. "Looks like we've got ourselves another volunteer for the Lord's work." Thomas rose to his feet, the pry bar clutched in hands that suddenly felt clumsy and inadequate. He had imagined this moment during his sleepless planning, had rehearsed what he'd say if discovered, how he'd explain his presence and perhaps convince the sisters to release their prisoners. But faced with the reality of Elizabeth's cold smile and the casual way she hefted her weapon, all his carefully prepared words evaporated like morning mist. "You don't understand," he began. But Elizabeth was already moving, crossing the barn floor with fluid grace of someone who'd done this many times before. Thomas swung the pry bar in a clumsy arc she avoided easily, stepping inside his reach and bringing the axe handle down across his skull with a sound like splitting kindling. Pain exploded through his head as he collapsed to the barn floor, his vision blurring and ears ringing with impact's echo. Through the growing darkness, he heard Samuel calling his name, heard the other prisoners stirring with the kind of hopeless agitation speaking of dreams repeatedly crushed. When consciousness returned, Thomas found himself chained to the wall beside Samuel, his head throbbing and mouth tasting of blood and bitter herbs. The barn looked different from this perspective, more cramped and desperate, filled with accumulated despair's weight that pressed down like a physical presence. Elizabeth stood before him, studying his face with the detached interest of someone examining new livestock. "Welcome to the family, Mr. Abernathy," she said. And Thomas realized with dawning horror that he was no longer this story's teller. He had become part of it, another victim in a nightmare showing no signs of ending. Time became a meaningless concept in the suffocating darkness of the Pike barn, measured not by days passing but by the rhythm of torment governing their existence. Thomas discovered the sisters operated on a schedule as rigid as any factory, rising before dawn to tend their legitimate farm work while their captives remained chained in shadow, emerging only when daylight could mask their slaves' presence as hired labor. The deception was so complete, so practiced that Thomas began understanding how an entire community could remain willfully blind to horrors happening just beyond their carefully averted gaze. During his 3rd week of captivity, Thomas witnessed the true extent of the Pike Sisters' methodology. Martha arrived at the barn carrying a wooden tray laden with clay cups filled with what appeared to be ordinary tea, her childlike smile never wavering as she moved from prisoner to prisoner with the gentle care of a nursemaid. But Thomas had learned to watch her eyes, had seen the calculating intelligence lurking behind her vacant expression. When she knelt beside an older man named Benjamin, who'd been there so long he responded only to the name 12, her voice took on the sing-song quality of someone reciting beloved scripture. "Drink up, my dear ones," she cooed, stroking Benjamin's matted hair with maternal tenderness. "This will help you remember your purpose, help you understand the beautiful work we're doing together. The Lord has chosen you all for something special, something pure and holy that the outside world wouldn't understand." Benjamin drank without resistance, his eyes already glazed with the resignation of someone whose spirit had been broken so thoroughly that compliance had become his only refuge from further pain. Thomas refused the tea, earning himself a blow from Elizabeth's axe handle that left his vision swimming with stars. But even through his pain, he watched Martha's transformation as her sister took over enforcement duties. The childlike mask slipped away like discarded clothing, revealing a mind that was both brilliant and utterly mad. "You still think you're better than us?" Martha said to Thomas, her voice losing all pretense of innocence. "Still think you understand right and wrong, good and evil? But you'll learn, just like they all learned. We're building paradise here, one soul at a time, one perfect child at a time." The other prisoners began remembering fragments of their own histories. Thomas became the lookout, developing an almost supernatural awareness of the sisters' movements and habits. He learned to recognize Martha's footsteps on the farmhouse porch, could distinguish Elizabeth's purposeful stride from her sister's lighter, more erratic gait. He memorized their schedule down to the minute, knowing when they'd be in the kitchen preparing their evening meal, when they'd retreat to separate rooms for private prayers, when they'd emerge for their nightly selection of victims. This knowledge became his weapon, the only advantage he possessed in a situation where physical strength and conventional escape were impossible. The storm arrived on a December night when temperature had dropped below freezing and wind carried the promise of snow that would trap them all until spring. Thomas felt the change in atmospheric pressure like weight settling on his chest, recognized the approaching tempest as the opportunity they'd been waiting for. Thunder would mask the sound of breaking chains. Lightning would provide momentary illumination without the risk of carrying a lantern. And the sisters would be distracted by the need to secure their property against the storm's fury. Samuel worked at his chain with desperate intensity as first fat raindrops began hammering against the barn roof. The loose floorboard creaked and groaned under pressure until finally, with a sound like snapping bone, the iron ring tore free from its moorings. Samuel's ankle remained shackled, but he could move freely within the barn's confines, his chain dragging behind him like the ghost of his former captivity. "Fire," he whispered to Thomas, his voice barely audible above the growing storm. "I'll set a fire in the hay to draw them out. When they come running, you get to the farmhouse. There's an old hunting rifle above the mantel, and Martha keeps the keys to all our chains in a wooden box beside her bed." The plan was desperate and flawed, dependent on timing and luck and the hope that men who'd been broken by years of captivity might find strength to fight when the moment came. But as Thomas looked around the barn at his fellow prisoners' faces, he saw something he hadn't expected, a flicker of the old determination that Martha's drugs and brutality had tried so hard to extinguish. They knew this might be their only chance, understood that failure would mean not just death but the continuation of horrors that had already claimed too many lives. Samuel moved with fluid grace of someone who'd mentally rehearsed every step 1,000 times. He gathered armfuls of old hay and straw, piling them against the barn's wooden walls in strategic locations that would create maximum smoke and confusion. The first flames caught just as a tremendous crack of thunder shook the building to its foundations, orange light dancing across the faces of men who'd lived in darkness for years. The fire spread with terrifying speed, feeding on dry timber and ancient wood forming the prison's walls. The barn door flew open as if kicked by a giant's boot, and Elizabeth charged through the smoke with her axe handle raised and murder blazing in her eyes. But she'd expected to find her prisoners cowering in their chains, not a coordinated rebellion led by men who'd rediscovered their capacity for righteous anger. Samuel met her charge with a broken length of chain, while Thomas, freed by the chaos and confusion, fought his way through the smoke toward the barn door and the farmhouse beyond. The sight greeting him in the Pike Sisters' kitchen was like a glimpse into the organizational mind behind 20 years of systematic horror. Martha's wooden box contained not just keys but detailed records written in her careful script, documenting every man they'd taken, every ritual they'd performed, every child born from their unholy unions and what had become of those offspring. The rifle above the mantel was loaded and ready, as if Martha had always known that someday their work might face violent opposition. When Thomas returned to the barn, he found a scene from Dante's deepest nightmare. The fire had spread to engulf nearly half the structure, casting everything in hellish orange light that made the violence seem even more surreal. Martha lay crumpled against the far wall, her neck bent at an unnatural angle from where she'd fallen during the initial confusion. Elizabeth, her face a mask of grief and rage, held Samuel by the throat while her other hand pressed a knife against his jugular. "You've killed her," she screamed, her voice breaking with the first genuine emotion Thomas had ever heard from her. "You've murdered the most holy woman who ever drew breath, and now you'll all burn for it." But the other prisoners had found weapons of their own, chains and farming tools and pieces of broken wood that became clubs in the hands of men who'd endured years of abuse and finally seen a chance for justice. They moved as one, driven by a collective fury that was both beautiful and terrible to witness. Elizabeth's knife clattered to the floor as she disappeared beneath a wave of bodies that had been reduced to nothing and now demanded everything back. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of testimony and investigation, of state police officers asking questions that should have been asked decades earlier, and reporters arriving from as far away as New York to document the scope of the Pike Sisters' crimes. Thomas's article, "The Silent Harvest of Black Creek," became front-page news in papers across the country, sparking outrage and calls for reform that reached all the way to the governor's office. Sheriff Brody was dismissed in disgrace, facing charges of criminal negligence and obstruction of justice that would see him spend the rest of his life in prison. The surviving men were gradually reunited with families who'd mourned them for years, though many would never fully recover from the psychological damage inflicted by their captivity. Samuel returned to Pennsylvania, where his sister Rebecca had indeed married but had never stopped hoping for news of her missing brother. Some of the older prisoners required permanent care, their minds too fractured by years of chemical and psychological abuse to function independently. Thomas himself became a reluctant hero, celebrated by colleagues and readers who saw his investigation as a triumph of journalistic integrity over small-town corruption. But the praise felt hollow when measured against the cost of the story, the knowledge that 37 men had suffered for years while he pursued his career in comfortable ignorance. He kept the photograph from the crime scene on his desk, not as a trophy but as a reminder of the price that truth demanded from everyone it touched. The image showed the Pike Sisters' barn after the fire, its charred timbers reaching toward a grey sky like the ribs of some massive beast. In the foreground, barely visible in the smoke-stained wreckage, lay the chains that had held so many men for so long, finally broken, but forever marking the spot where evil had flourished in the silence of ordinary people who chose not to see.